Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Making a Killing, the podcast from Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy initiative on how corruption is reshaping global politics. My name's Nate Sibley and I'll be your guide on this journey into the darker corners of the global economy. For those of you following the news, there are no prizes for guessing the main topic of today's episode, which is the worsening condition of Russian opposition leader and anti-corruption champion Alexei Navalny. But before that, I wanted to flag an upcoming Hudson Institute online event that may be of interest, and that is an interview about kleptocracy in Venezuela with interim President Juan Guaido and his economic advisor Carlos Paparoni. We often think of Russia as the archetypal kleptocracy, but arguably there's no better or more tragic example of how a wealthy democracy can collapse under a regime bent on embezzling oil payments and which also now engages in gold smuggling and drug trafficking. You can watch the event at 12 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, April 23rd at hudson.org. Navalny has proven a constant thorn in Vladimir Putin's side. He and his anti-corruption foundation have exposed billions of dollars worth of corruption scams, crooked deals, and secret palatial estates owned by Putin's inner circle. He's done so with a wry sense of humour and a video campaign that connects with Russia's younger generation. Navalny was poisoned by Russian security services in August last year. After a miraculous recovery in Germany, he then heroically returned to Russia in January, knowing he would be detained or worse. He was duly jailed by a kangaroo court in Moscow, and his physical condition has deteriorated very seriously in prison in recent days, where he has been on hunger strike over being denied access to medical treatment. Last week, the Biden administration announced a new package of sanctions on Russian entities involved in election interference and the illegal occupation of Crimea, but they conspicuously did not mention Alexei Navalny. So as well as talking about Russian corruption and Navalny's situation this week, we'll also be spending some time on what the US and other democracies should be doing to respond to an increasingly problematic Russian regime. Joining me to do so are not one but two experts this week. The first will be well known to anyone working on Russia or corruption issues, and that's the financier Bill Browder, who is author of the book Red Notice, which tells the story of how the Russian estate turned on him and his investment firm, murdered his colleague, the lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who had uncovered a massive state-backed tax fraud. Inspired to find justice for Magnitsky and deliver accountability to his killers, Bill has become the driving force and public face behind a successful international campaign for the introduction of sanctions against human rights abusers and corrupt officials worldwide. I'll also be speaking with Maria Snegovaya, a Russia expert and academic. We'll be talking about how Russians view not only the regime's corruption, but also Navalny himself. And as always, at the end of the show, I'll be reviewing recent news with journalist and researcher Casey Michel and congressional policy advisor Paul Massaro. Without further ado, let's get stuck in and hear from Bill Browder. Okay, well, Bill, thank you so much for joining Making a Killing today. Really grateful. Can't think of anyone better to speak to with your insights, your long campaign for justice for Sergei Magnitsky. And I suppose that leads to an obvious opening question, which do you see any parallels and or differences between what happened to Sergei Magnitsky and what is now happening to Alexei Navalny in Russia today?
Well, the main parallel is that Sergei Magnitsky exposed corruption of the Putin regime. In his case, he exposed a very specific $230 million scam that Russian officials committed, and then he was tortured. Medical care was withheld when he got sick in prison, and then he died. And the similarities are that Alexei Navalny exposed corruption of the Putin regime. They retaliated by first trying to kill him in a different way and then arresting him, denying medical care, and now he's on death's door. The main difference between the two cases is that when Sergei was in jail and being tortured and being withheld, when they withheld medical attention, the world wasn't watching.
Right.
But the world is watching every step of the slow motion assassination of Alexei Navalny. And what's remarkable is that as the world watches, as the world howls in outrage, Vladimir Putin isn't flinching.
Right. And, I guess that leads again to another question. What do you think Putin is trying to communicate, trying to tell, presumably not only Russians, but the rest of the world, the rest of us who are watching this? What is he saying about his regime, his grip on power?
Well, Putin is a hostage to his own psychology, and he's a hostage to the situation of his own making. And what I mean by that is that he's living in a world where if he shows any sign of weakness, any sign of compromise, he feels like, and he's probably not wrong, he feels like that opens the door for other people to try to take his power away from him. Mm-hmm. And it's like a prison yard. Russia is like a prison yard, and everybody in the prison yard is just staring each other down. And the moment that somebody looks at each other askance with disrespect, they have to be dealt with. And that's how Putin deals with everybody. Mm-hmm. And Alexei Navalny disrespected him. Justifiably, he disrespected him. He said, right. Look, you're a crook. You're mm-hmm. stealing from the Russian people. You're stealing from me. You're ruining the future of Russia.
He was honest with him rather than disrespecting with him, I suppose.
but in this case, he's disrespecting him by not going along with the fraud, not going along with the cover up, and so he was disrespected by Navalny, and he had to show the world, and he has to show the world in his mind mm-hmm. that if somebody disrespects him like that, they're going to be dealt with harshly. And normally what he would hope for is some kind of capitulation from Navalny. But Navalny is not capitulating. Navalny is not saying, oh, sir, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have exposed your corruption. I was lying. It's all wrong. Navalny is saying, you're ruining my country. You can do anything you want to me. I'm not afraid. And that's just the worst thing that Putin could ever face, because every day that this goes on, Navalny's profile, his stature is raised. He's mm-hmm. now on par with Vladimir Putin. And in doing this, Vladimir Putin has set a trap for himself, because Alexei Navalny could genuinely become president of Russia based on what's happened so far. Mm-hmm. And so Putin can't back down. Right. But if Putin doesn't back down and he kills Navalny, it will set off a chain reaction of things that nobody could predict, but I think would be hugely harmful to Putin. I think that there will be massive domestic outrage, and there will be certainly massive international consequences.
We can come back to what those might be in just a minute, what you think they should be in a minute. I just wanted to sort of rewind a bit. What role, we sort of dived into it with Navalny's role in all of this, but what role does kleptocracy play, as a very sort of simple question for our listeners, what role does kleptocracy play in sustaining Putin's regime? Is it part of it? Is it, he lets people skim a little off the side, but ultimately actually, like he is the president of Russia and he controls the security services and that's where his power comes from? Or does his power rest on these illicit sort of financial networks, or is it some sort of combination? And also, I know you and your colleagues have made sort of estimates even of how much maybe has been looted from Russia in the past. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the scale of the kleptocracy as well.
Well, so the first and foremost, Vladimir Putin is a kleptocrat. He's a crook. He's a thief. That's what is the driving force behind everything that's happened. Mm-hmm. And so what has he done? Vladimir Putin, when he came into power, he then started to steal money. And I'm not talking about small amounts of money. I'm talking about tens of billions of dollars a year he's stealing from the Russian state and from others in Russia. Now, that is a hard thing to do, but it makes it even harder because in theory, Russia is a democracy. So all these people who are being stolen from, and so in my estimate, you have 1,000 people who have stolen over the last 20 years, $1 trillion from the Russian state. I think Putin is worth 200 billion, mm-hmm. and the other 999 have stolen 800 billion. And where do I get those numbers from? That's the rough estimate of corruption capital flight that's come out of Russia over the last 20 years. And those numbers have been reinforced by various estimates of the money laundering scandals at Danske Bank and various other places. Yep. And so now you have $1 trillion of money being stolen. And what should that money have been used for? That money should have been used for hospitals, schools, roads, airports, telecommunications networks. But instead, the life expectancy for a Russian male is like 15 years younger than an average European country. Schools are a complete disaster. Mm-hmm. The roads, fall away to nothing the moment you get out of Moscow.
Yep.
And it's a complete and we're in what's supposed to be a democracy. And so the average Russian thinks that they should be able to choose their president, but their president is stealing from them. Mm-hmm. And so what does Putin do in response to this whole sort of requirement of democracy? Well, one is he cheats, and he eliminates anybody who could be an opponent because he doesn't want somebody else like an Alexei Navalny who will show up and say, look, this is a big scam. You've all been ripped off for the last 20 years. Life could be a lot better. We don't even have to do that much. All we have to do is stop stealing.
Yeah.
And it's not just Alexei Navalny. Boris Nemtsov was saying it, and he was shot dead.
Right.
Garry Kasparov was saying it. He's in exile. And so Putin is because of the kleptocracy, he's had to put the screws to everybody who's challenging him, make sure that nobody else could become president. Because what's Putin ultimately afraid of now? Putin is ultimately afraid that if somebody else were to come to power, he would lose all the money that he stole, mm-hmm. and he would go to jail. And he's most afraid if he was in jail, he would die like Alexei Navalny is dying right now.
Right. No, so the stakes really couldn't be. It's an existential issue for him, the continuance of his kleptocracy and the covering up of it. We begin to see why Alexei Navalny has become such a threat. With that in mind, and the importance of supporting democracy, the democratic movement in Russia, and keeping Alexei Navalny alive, do you think the statements and the sanctions we've seen from the Biden administration so far are a sufficient deterrent to Putin in this case? I mean, it's a bit of a strange question because the Biden administration didn't actually mention Navalny in relation to the specific sanctions package that came out last week. And on the same theme, of course, what about similar responses from the EU, the UK, and other democratic countries?
So far, the sanctions have been grossly inadequate. The sanctions on the Navalny situation have been against a small number of officials. And the officials were not low-level officials. These were some very senior officials, but they were officials. Mm-hmm. And Alexei Navalny commented on this before it happened. He said that the sanctions against officials are not unhelpful, but they don't really get to the core of the problem. And he said, and this was in testimony in front of the European Parliament, he said that you need to sanction Putin's cashiers, the people who look after Putin's money. And he went so far as making a list of these people. And he shared this list with his own organization. And he said, if anything is to happen to me, anything untoward happens to me when I return to Russia, you take this list to the US, to the EU, to the UK, and to Canada, and you get these countries to sanction these 35 people under the Magnitsky Act, mm-hmm. so their assets are frozen and their visas are canceled. And he went back to Russia, and the worst came to the worst. He's now on death's door. His organization shared this list, but so far, nobody has acted on it. And the US government, the White House, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor of the president, made an announcement which sounded tough to say that if Alexei Navalny were to die, there's going to be serious consequences. Mm-hmm. But what he really should have said is that there will be serious consequences right now for what they've already done to Alexei Navalny. He shouldn't be in jail, he shouldn't have been poisoned, and he shouldn't be denied medical attention. And so in my mind, the right policy should be to take the list that Alexei Navalny provided of the 35 names and sanction 5 of them, the first 5 today. And let it be known to Putin that if anything more happens to Alexei, then another 5 will be sanctioned. And then another 5. And if he were to die, everyone on that list will be sanctioned and then some. Mm-hmm. And Alexei knows who Putin's cashiers are because he's probably the foremost corruption investigator in Russia. And it can be easily cross-referenced and verified by the governments themselves. And by the way, if that were to happen, that would save Alexei Navalny's life.
was going to ask you about that just very quickly, because I suppose one of the counter-arguments might be the things that the US government is concerned about is if they now sanction Putin in the way you've described it, the way that Navalny wanted, with Navalny in Putin's clutches, that might provoke Putin and we lose our leverage and he just kills Navalny anyway. What's the kind of counter-argument to that?
Well, the counter-argument is, first of all, you're not losing your leverage because you're only sanctioning 5 out of the 35. There's another 30 to go. And Putin only understands, it's not like you can talk nice to Putin and he'll behave himself. All he cares about is real consequences.
Right.
This is a hostage situation in which we have to show that we're ready to go hardball.
That's great. And so just to finish, Bill, because I know you're very busy at the moment, and I don't want to detain you for too long, but one of the other things beyond sanctions that you've talked about is cracking down on Putin's enablers in the West, the lawyers, the bankers who facilitate the money laundering out of Russia, that $1 trillion perhaps that you mentioned earlier. What are some of the things we can do to try and dismantle Putin's external support network, the people who are really propping up Russia's kleptocracy without ever setting foot in Russia itself necessarily?
Well, you have a whole network of banks. So if you have $1 trillion that left Russia, went through Danske Bank and all sorts of Ukio Bank and Trust to Commerce Bank and all sorts of banks throughout the Baltics and Scandinavia. And as far as I'm aware, there's not a single one of those bankers who is involved in $1 trillion of money laundering that's sitting in jail right now. Mm-hmm. And so, as a Western banker, if the reward is commissions on money laundering, and by the way, they make a lot more money on $1 trillion of dirty money than they make on honest money, so that's the reward, and there's no risk because there's nothing bad will happen to you. Then guess what? Businessmen, when there's no risk and a lot of reward, will go with the profitable option. And so in the West, we need to create a situation where the rewards are equally risky. Mm-hmm. In other words, that if you get caught, you go to jail. And guess what? Most of these people don't want to go to jail. They want to go home to their families in the evening and eat supper at their table with their kids. They don't want to be sitting in prison. And all it takes is putting a few of these people in jail and enforcing the law. But what I've discovered, because we've been involved in tracing the money from the Magnitsky case for the last 10 years, is that even with hard evidence, these prosecutors in most countries, for different reasons in different countries, either can't or won't actually take this stuff on.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for your time today, for your insights, your tremendous experience in pushing back against Putin's kleptocracy while pursuing justice for Sergei Magnitsky is an inspiration to everyone, certainly in the anti-corruption community that I work in. I know, as I said, I know you're very busy, so we're gonna let you go now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, no one knows more about how to hit Putin in the pocketbook than Bill Browder, but I wanted to dive a little deeper into some of the issues we discussed, and particularly find out more about what Russians themselves think of Putin's corruption and Navalny's efforts to expose it. So here's my conversation with Maria Snegovaya, a Russia expert and academic at the Atlantic Council, George Washington University and Virginia Tech University. Okay, well, hi Maria, and thank you so much for joining me on the show today. We're recording this on Wednesday. I should say events are pretty fast moving in Russia around this issue. Putin has just delivered his State of the Nation address warning the West not to cross a, quote, red line in its dealings with Russia. At the same time, he's massing Russian troops on the Ukrainian border. And as we've heard, he's denying medical treatment to Alexei Navalny in jail. Something which has prompted thousands of Russians to also take to the streets today in protests. And I was just reading before we came on, around 400 so far have been arrested. I'm pretty sure we can expect that number to sort of keep rising, unfortunately. So just to kick off, though, with, I asked this to Bill just now, but about the nature of Putin's regime, because I think it's good to get different perspectives. You've described the Russian regime as being neo-patrimonial. What do you mean by that term, and what role do you see corruption playing in the structure of Putin's regime?
Thanks a lot for having me, Nate. It's a big honor to be here with our audiences today. So yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that actually tapped to the core of the issue because in order to understand how the regime behaves, it's important to understand what it is And the nature, from my perspective, that the regime neo-patrimonial refers precisely to how the structure of the system is organized. It's not an ideological regime, not based on specific, ideology, although, of course, all these overtones about fight against the West, etc., we'll get there later. But the essence is that the regime relies on redistribution of spoils, of rent that the regime gets primarily, of course, for resource rent, but also it can be anything, really. Two groups. The elites, primarily the narrow circles of the elites that influence to some extent policymaking in the country, and broader population groups. So such regimes actually allow the elite members access to various forms of illicit rents, patronage, and corruption, actually, as you pointed out, is part of this systems, of this element of this system. Ultimately, the goal essentially to ensure that because of this very well kind of defined system of redistribution to the elites and to the population, all the groups of the society will be in some way kind of parts of this whole system, and that will ensure their long-term loyalty, and they will be less likely to rebel against the highest ruler. Usually such regimes are personalistic, by the way. That's exactly the way we see it in Russia. The formal institutions do not matter much. They actually erode formal institutions, which are actually very bad in the long term. And we find a lot of similar regimes in post-Soviet space, as well as in Africa as well.
So what is life like for ordinary Russians living under such a regime? It's perhaps hard for someone like me sitting in my comfy office in Washington, D.C. to sort of imagine having a government that organizes itself in that way. I take a lot of things for granted about what government does for me and what governments can expect from me. But Putin's regime has depleted the public coffers, and raided the private sector over decades now. We're talking about. So, what do the Russian people think about this? Are they, in your view, like, are they aware of the scale of the corruption and the way that their government is structured? What are they concerned about this?
So all very important questions. So first of all, because of the way I think we can describe the regime, the two main objectives are really not improving the well-being of the society, but instead to maintain power and enrich the narrow elite circles, precisely as in line with that logic. And as you have pointed out, the population actually is a little bit on the side of it. It does partake in this system of redistribution, otherwise the population will be unhappy and rebel eventually, but it actually is the kind of the last in this chain of redistribution. And because so much is based on this redistribution of rent, extraction of resources in one way or another is one of the key elements of the regime. In the early days when Putin just came to power, there was actually everything was good in the Russian economy. It was growing, partly the result of the economic reforms, late Yeltsin, early Putin reforms. Also, of course, the oil price was booming and the economy was recovering from the 1998 crisis. So all of these factors combined actually led to a very big growth for the Russian economy in mid-2000s when there was a lot of incomes revenues to redistribute to the rest of the groups. Also, the society was less state controlled at the time, so there was a lot of incentives for development. Unfortunately, in the later years, of course, those incentives have slowly all disappeared. First of all, since the 2008 crisis, Russia's economy, and actually not just the Russia's economy, this has been a global problem, has not completely recovered, has not really been able to grow to the extent that it has grown before, despite the fact that actually the oil prices have been quite decent in the continuous time. The next problem was that because of the Putin's regime structure, the regulation, over-regulation continues. The state increasingly takes more and more of the economy. The regime is not welcoming independent groups in the society, and hence it's very hostile to independent business as well. As a result, the state dependence has grown, and by 2016-17, we had about up to 70% of GDP produced by state-linked companies, by public sector, as opposed to only 35% in 2005. It just shows you that essentially we're going back slowly but steadily into the Soviet times. Of course, this is not a command economy, but it's increasingly getting much more regulated. In this situation, there's fewer incentives for people to be innovative, to create, to be creative, and that of course also kind of influences the economic growth, the negative dynamic. And ultimately, of course, Putin's system is unable to reform. This whole patronage structure, the corruption structure, is actually based on very nuanced internal connections, informal relationships, and it's not welcome in reform, because that would, any reform, any decrease in the size of officials, bureaucracy, would decrease the opportunities for corruption. Hence, it will not. It will create more people who are unhappy with the regime, undermine the origin of this loyalty for Putin and the structures that he has created. So reforms are not possible, despite the fact that this issue of when new reforms are going to be coming, always reemerging every electoral cycle. But we need to understand that the key essence of the regime, it's not going to be able to reform. As a result, yes, people have been kind of made used to living in the situation of continuous economic stagnation. Putin, therefore, had been looking for alternative sources of legitimacy. If he cannot increase revenues for people, what is going to be? And we have seen this short victorious wars, quote unquote victorious, in Crimea. But those were followed by sanctions, which further actually erode in economic growth. We have an upcoming report with Anders Alslund, actually, where we show that in this regard, Western sanctions have been successful. They've been cutting off, decreasing Russia's economic growth over the last years to 2 to 3% per year, perhaps even annually, depends on the estimate. Yeah, and so it's a very pronounced effect in this sense. Therefore, there's no source for economic growth. Of course, in this situation, population suffers. We have faced a new reality for Russia, where for about the last 7 years, the real disposable incomes of Russians have been in decline. So largely after Crimea, but even before, they were not growing that fast. But the population, unfortunately, bears this legacy of the Soviet times. It's not very civically active. It's used to rely on the state. It's very paternalistic in its expectations, despite some promising trends among the younger generation. And therefore, they're sort of kind of tolerating that, despite the fact that their frustration is growing. And then we see this frustration being reflected in the growing dissatisfaction with Putin. The support for the authorities has been eroding. The Crimea effect is gone, but the society is still quite tolerant of this situation. On your question specifically about corruption, it is important. It remains third or fourth topic among the concerns that Russians consistently name, according to the polls. But it's not the first. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why Navalny has based he's focused all of his political strategy around his corruption. Just remember, this corruption topic reminded our audiences that Navalny's foundation is called Anti-Corruption Foundation, right? He deliberately made this the key point of his strategy. It worked to some extent, but in light of all these issues that I highlighted before, and also because this concept in Russia of corruption being invincible, it's something that's consistently present in Russia's political system for centuries. There's this famous saying by one of Russia's famous 19th century writers, wake me up in 200 years, ask me what happens in Russia, and I will respond, they're stealing, they're being corrupt, essentially. Yeah, and he was not wrong, by the way, because if he was awake right now, he totally he would realize it was exactly true. So because of that, the key issues that Russians name as their top concerns is not corruption. As I said, it's number 3 or 4 on the number of concerns. The first ones are prices, unemployment, and poverty. These are the 3 top issues, the economic issues that consistently represent the key concerns for Russians. But as I said, it's a longer term effect. This erodes support for Putin over long term. It's not going to be something that will deliver final blow to the regime anyway in the near future.
So there's an enormous amount of sort of cynicism about alternatives to Putin is what I'm kind of hearing. Sort of next question, given the events of this week, how do Russians see Alexei Navalny? There's tons of coverage of him in the West now. As Bill said, he's this week he's as famous as Putin himself, at least. But a lot of the coverage tends to treat him, because this is the way that we Westerners sort of view the world, as a democratic opposition leader, kind of not in exile, but as a sort of president in waiting of a democratic Russia. Is that how Russians see him, or do they see him in a different way?
So it's a great question, and it's a little bit tricky to answer because Russian society is divided. First of all, there's those Russians who get the primary information from state TV channels, usually older groups, 55 plus. But there's still a very large share of the population. It used to be 90% when Putin came to power. In recent years, because the internet has been increasingly penetrated to society, and frankly, the TV coverage has gotten so boring and so focused on Ukraine that even longer-term supporters of Putin don't want to watch it anymore. Over the recent years, the number of TV viewers has been declining consistently, but it's still about 65, perhaps 70% of Russians. On the other side, you see a growing number of people who rely on internet. And the interesting thing that in recent years, we see that the political views of those two groups, pretty much the opposites of each other. So, of course, the state TV viewers, they get all of this classic state TV propaganda. They're also older people, so they have those older attitudes largely shaped by Soviet experiences. They also the ones who remember the 2000s and the economic growth. So they still are grateful to Putin for this unprecedented improvement in their well-being, really unprecedented in the Russian history that they experienced in 2000s. So those people, of course, will view Navalny as an enemy of the state, corrupt, just another, hungry for power person who wants to erode this carefully built foundations of the state and then undermine Putin's achievements, etc., etc. And of course, the foreign agent as well. And then, of course, you have this growing number of people on the internet, many of them younger, especially those below 35 years old, approximately, who view Navalny as the future. This is a very unfortunate group of Russian population who find themselves being a minority in the society because the share of those who are, I think, below 30, it's about 14-16% in Russia only. It's an older country, unfortunately, and they see absolutely no future under current regime, absolutely no prospects for them, right? All of the positions, like there's no economic growth, all of the positions on the career ladder are occupied by older people in position of power, and or their nearest family. There's a famous joke in Russia whether a mayor's son can become a general. No, because the general has his own son. And that's exactly what we observe right now. There's no social lifts, there's no future for these people. Therefore, of course, they increasingly become more resentful with the system, with the regime, and they found one of the potential ways to express that was what Navalny offered them. So these people view Navalny very favorably. They're very large supporters of him, up to 50%, according to different polls in this particular group, are Navalny supporters. But on the broader population, unfortunately, support for Navalny, especially when, for example, people are asked the so-called open question, who of the Russian politicians you trust, Navalny gets about 3 to 5%. It depends how you look at it. Yes, it's not a lot, especially compared to Putin, who gets, for example, 25 to 30%. But note that this is at 3 to 5% at the federal level in the situation when Navalny had no access to state TV channels whatsoever, or was portrayed there as an enemy traitor and horrible person. So in that situation, he did achieve absolutely a lot, and this 3 to 5% actually is near to what so-called Russian system opposition leaders get, like, for example, the permanent leader of the Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov. And that's actually quite a large number. Overall, the share of people who approved Navalny's activity, his anti-corruption investigation, has grown over the last 7 years from 6 to 20%. That's another very significant achievement, unquestionable, and absolutely above anything was remotely possible for non-systemic Russian opposition in the past. So from this perspective, Navalny is really one and only. He has absolutely political genius in the Russian political context, who has been able to achieve completely unprecedented successes in Russia's absolutely closed-off political system without many changes. So from that perspective, yes, he is absolutely one and only, but we should still be aware that his absolute numbers of support are still not significant. And the sad reality is actually shown these days in the streets of Russia. We are recording this podcast as Russians are protesting in the streets in support of Navalny. And unfortunately, despite the fact that Navalny is actually literally being killed in the jail right now, there's not enough. There's a lot of Russians, very courageous, brave Russians who are risking a lot these days when they show in those unauthorized protests, but there's still not enough of them, not enough to significantly change the current situation. Just one example, Navalny's team announced as a new benchmark on their website that they needed 500,000 registered people to sign up for the protest before they announced a new one. And unfortunately, they couldn't get that number. They only got 460,000 people. They had to announce the new protest without waiting up until 500,000 people because Navalny's health has been deteriorating really fast. That's just another important indicator. So the protest is growing. The resentment with Putin is accumulating, but the sheer number of the protesters, the people who are willing to speak up, who are not afraid, and who really care about what's going on, there's still not enough.
So we're coming sort of towards the end of our time, Maria, and your insights have just been absolutely packed with interesting information. I think a really important point for when we think about policy towards Russia, that last one, Alexei Navalny is a complicated, Russians have a complicated view of him, and his support isn't maybe as widespread as we would like to sort of pretend to ourselves in the West when we read the headlines. Doesn't mean we shouldn't support him and the brave Russians, as you say. But it's worth bearing in mind. But on that note, the theme of this episode is kind of like not only Navalny's situation, but what we in the West, what the US, the EU, other democracies should be doing to respond. And in a recent paper, you sort of highlighted there were sanctions last week announced by the Biden administration. They did not mention Alexei Navalny, in fact, and we've had various statements and things from various governments, but nothing sort of devastating from Putin's point of view, I think. And just on that note, in a recent paper, you highlighted the need to back up sanctions with strong anti-money laundering enforcement and reforms where necessary to tighten those loopholes around which Putin's cronies can evade sanctions and launder money. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about that as well, and the importance of why have sanctions if you're not going to enforce the ecosystem around them that makes them work.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Nate. I have to say, and it's a very important question, and I'm still not very happy with the current sanctions that have been announced by the Biden administration. I'm not going to bite for the regime. Here, we're actually circling back to where we started, that the nature of regime is neo-patrimonial, as I said before. Putin is dependent on his ability to redistribute rent to his closest cronies, his closest elites, and the population more broadly. So my suggestions to the West, if we are really serious about reinforcing, about making sanctions work and influencing Putin regime hidden where it hurts, they're twofold. First of all, as you said, yes, there is a lot of individual sanctions that target oligarchs, mostly Putin's officials. It's harder to target oligarchs because you have to prove their link to the regime, etc. Those are great, but at this point, Russian elites are not stupid. They understand they're not going to be able to go to the West, where, especially given that this quasi-war, Cold War kind of relationship with the West. Those who choose to stick with Putin, they understand that. So not being able to go to the West is not a very serious blow to them, and not seriously undermines the regime, particularly that Putin compensates them for, again, increasing redistribution, providing some generous packages, etc. Where it hurts is that the Russian elites still keep their assets in the West, because ironically, they still rely on the Western institutions because they were absolutely not able to build anything remotely similar in Russia. So again, if you want to hurt them, you need to identify those assets that they keep in the West and target those. Unfortunately, until now, the systemic effort to fight money laundering and collect information about freezing the assets about Putin's cronies, it has not started. In the US, there's actually some hope, especially given the beneficial ownership reporting requirements in the National Defense Authorization Act. And there seems to be some promising development on the Biden's administration side in enforcing that rule. the new package actually also, the one that Biden also announced, actually targets the nearest family of the Russian cronies, which is also good news. But the problem is the EU. The key place where those assets are kept is the European Union. And this is where something similar needs to be implemented if we are serious about, again, hidden Putin's cronies. So far, the EU has done the opposite. So far, it decided, hey, we're fighting money laundering, so let's just expose the information about the accounts Russians keep abroad to the Kremlin. Talk about essentially, shooting yourself into the foot. The problem is that many Russians, especially opposition-minded Russians, of course, keep their money abroad. But you have now just provided the Kremlin another source of revenues. Now they know that these people have this money outside, and now they're absolutely going to figure out the way to extract this money, particularly given that their own revenues are shrinking. And the second element of the sanctions design, in addition to reinforcing the individual sanctions with its assets freezes, would be definitely targeting this Kremlin-linked revenue streams, primarily perhaps by targeting major state-controlled companies. Well, gas, oil, probably not possible because the EU is very dependent on the gas. But for example, state-controlled banks that the Kremlin uses as its geopolitical tools, like VEB, ex-Внешэкономбанк, would be definitely a serious blow to the regime. At the same time, a fairly easy thing to do to the West if we're really serious, again, to undermine the rent revenues that the regime relies on to ensure the loyalty of the elites and the population.
That's fantastic, Maria. I like that you go a bit deeper and you thought about the way that the regime is structured. And, you do hear these calls to sanction what they call the Navalny 8 or the Navalny 35. They're these big oligarchs. But really attacking Putin's his personal revenue streams basically is another way of really hitting him in the pocketbook, which as we've heard is the thing that he's most worried about. But we've actually come to the end of our time now, unfortunately, because we have so many guests on today because it's such an important issue. But that was really insightful, Maria, and I'm so grateful for your time. And I hope to have you back on the show at some point in the future to talk more about Russia.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome to the news and analysis section of the show. Joining me, as always, are congressional policy advisor Paul Massaro and journalist and author Casey Michel. Obviously, the fate of Alexei Navalny and all who bravely campaign for freedom in Russia is foremost in our minds this week, and we will certainly talk about that a lot more in just a moment. But first, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to run through some of the other notable and also maybe perhaps a bit more obscure developments from around the world of global kleptocracy. First, senior Biden advisor Juan Gonzalez blamed predatory elites in migrants' home countries for the crisis on the US southern border. He said he and Vice President Harris will be launching a regional anti-corruption task force to address the problem. In Kyrgyzstan, a former prime minister, and I apologize in advance for the pronunciation, but Kubanichbek Jumalayev, I can see Casey, who is a Central Asia scholar, smiling on the Zoom recording in the background. The former prime minister who had been charged with corruption, he was released from pre-trial detention after he paid the equivalent of almost $12 million in compensatory damages to the state treasury there. Back to Europe or Africa, or both. The Teodorin Obiang, the playboy son of Equatorial Guinea's president, was spotted attending a private audience with no less than the Pope in Rome, prompting really sharp criticism from campaigners like Tutu Alicante, who point out that Obiang's rampant and decidedly unrepentant corruption has made his country one of the poorest in the world. And then something still in Europe, but something a bit different. In Belgium, police launched a massive operation against the growing power of Colombian cartel-backed drugs trafficking gangs. They seized 27 tons of cocaine in Antwerp, and they also arrested, interestingly, several public officials, including police officers. It just indicates the extent to which cartels are now starting to favour Europe over the US. Lower risk of getting caught, higher prices, but also for the purposes of a kleptocracy podcast, the extent to which their operations, like they do everywhere, are beginning to spread crime and corruption throughout the region to a sort of unprecedented extent. So very much a trend to watch there. On the policy side, a couple of really interesting developments, which I'm going to hand over to you guys for. Casey, perhaps you could explain a bit about what the good news from Canada this week.
Yes, Nate, thanks for that, and obviously for running through the news of the week as well. There's it seems like more and more to keep up with every time we check in with one another. The biggest news on the anti-shell company, anti-anonymous shell company, and beneficial ownership front this week came, less than 24 hours ago from when we're recording right now, and that is the announcement from the Canadian government that Ottawa is going to be finally implementing a beneficial ownership registry. That is to say, at long last, the Canadian government has recognized the problem of anonymous shell company formation in Canada, has recognized the fallout, the threats, the roles that those corporate structures play in transnational crime, corruption, and money laundering. And they are very much following the lead of the Americans, following the lead of the Brits, following the lead of other countries that have announced they are going to be implementing a beneficial ownership registry. That is to say, a registry of the names and the addresses of those behind the shell companies set up in Vancouver, set up in Quebec, set up in Newfoundland, set up in the Yukon, set up wherever in Canada, so that authorities can finally track those who are behind this. But beyond that, that in and of itself is huge news, because after the American legislation earlier this year that the National Defense Authorization Act, that the U.S. is going to be implementing its own beneficial ownership registry, that left, frankly, the Canadians as the odd man out as it pertains to anonymous shell company formation. The term that they use in Canada, which I actually I like it. It's catchy. It's memorable. Is snow washing. I mean, I think it's a nice little bit of branding from pro-transparency,
money laundering branding. Yeah.
Activists. Look, it's they took it, they ran with it, and I will say, to their credit, it seems to have worked, and certainly to have stuck. So what we saw just yesterday was the announcement from Ottawa that they are going to be bankrolling, financing the creation of this beneficial ownership registry. It'll be launched in 4 years in 2025, and beyond that, it is going to be publicly accessible. So journalists like myself, investigators elsewhere, civil society activists, human rights activists can finally begin tracking the Francophone Africa kleptocrats, the Chinese kleptocrats, the post-Soviet kleptocrats that have turned time and again, that we have seen turn time and again, to the Manitobas, to the Saskatchewans, to the Quebecs, to the Newfoundlands, et cetera, of the country, to use these shell companies to launder their gains. So I just want to applaud the Canadian government, applaud Transparency International Canada, which has absolutely led the charge on this. So it was great. It was relatively unexpected, but it's fantastic news.
It's interesting that you guys that you mentioned the great sort of PR, the branding of it as snow washing, because actually Canada is one of the countries, particularly British Columbia, where this issue of foreign money, particularly going into real estate, has actually become
Vancouver,
an issue of public and public concern, political debate. Quite often, some of the ideas we talk about on here, they're kind of wonkish, like they're things that experts within the Beltway or law enforcement officials find interesting, but sometimes there has been that struggle to sort of connect with how does this affect the ordinary American, the ordinary Canadian, the ordinary European Britain. But in the case of British Columbia, huge public scandal about how, particularly about this laundering of money through casinos into real estate by drugs trafficking gangs linked to China, linked to the cartels. So it's also it's unfortunate, but all this happened. But it's also as they start to introduce these reforms, hopefully going to be a good news story about how engaging and an interesting case study about how you engage public opinion to close these loopholes.
Yeah, Nate, just to build on that point right there for a moment, I was in Vancouver 2 years ago reporting on this phenomenon, reporting on these networks, reporting on some of the findings that were beginning to come out from the local British Columbian government. And things in Vancouver, obviously we see this model replicate itself. New York, Miami, Houston, LA, you pick a Western, certainly North American city, you're going to find this phenomenon of money laundering via shell companies, via real estate. But things had gotten so bad in Vancouver, to get back to the branding comment, that international investigative authorities in Australia, in New Zealand, in the US, and in Canada as well, had taken to describing the broader phenomenon specifically as the Vancouver model, the Vancouver model, the linkages of illicit capital, dirty money flowing out of especially China and Hong Kong through the casinos, through organized crime rackets that ended up in real estate, driving up the prices for everybody else, pricing out local populations, ended up in things like vote buying scandals. I mean, this was an especially pronounced aspect and case study of the phenomenon that we talk about every single week.
Awesome. Paul, some other good news this week, this time from across the pond in the UK, pertaining to their own version of global Magnitsky sanctions, which we've been talking about earlier on in the podcast. So I wonder if you could update us on that.
So this has been a long time coming down the line. We'd been expecting that, the Foreign Minister of the UK, Dominic Raab, would make an announcement like this, but it's always great to see it actually happen, that the UK Magnitsky sanctions will include corruption. And of course, until now, the UK Magnitsky sanctions have been on human rights abuse, and that is similar to the EU Magnitsky sanctions. So once the UK Magnitsky sanctions include corruption, it'll be the EU that remains the only, I guess in this particular case, a block of countries, but the only political entity that's adopted these Magnitsky sanctions without also having corruption provisions, which means that synchronization and harmonization will be much, much more difficult with EU sanctions. We'd certainly love to see the EU adopt corruption provisions. And as I've said before, corruption under these targeted sanctions makes an awful lot of sense, because oftentimes these individuals who engage in these transnational corrupt acts have a lot of money sitting around in these areas like the EU, like the UK, like the USA, like Canada, as we just discussed.
And if they don't, it blocks them from bringing it in. This is what people often forget. People always think sanctions are this offensive weapon that the US belligerently uses to bully and destroy other countries' economies. In fact, they're also a highly defensive measure. You sanction someone, they can't bring their dirty money into your country.
They're a primarily defensive measure, I might argue.
And Paul, I was just going to say, the framing of, or the notion of, that you can, implement something called the Magnitsky Act or whatever jurisdiction it may be in without having an element of corruption or counter-corruption or counter-kleptocracy within that, it strikes me as so just bizarre and strange, given who Sergei Magnitsky was, given what he was doing, given what he was researching, and given what he was killed for. That is to say, grand corruption, ill-gotten gains. That is why he was killed by Russian authorities. And yes, it's a human rights abuse, but to have a program like that without an element of corruption or corrupt-facing language in that, it just strikes me as almost offensive to the legacy of Magnitsky himself.
Yes. I mean, I absolutely agree. And I mean, of course, you, as in any political scenario, you try to get something in place and then build on top of that, right? And I think in sort of the UK's case, that's what happened. And it's very exciting to see this next stage. And I think there will be building pressure on the EU to, of course, adopt a corruption framework inside their Magnitsky sanctions. Of course, we're also still expecting that Australia and Japan and Taiwan, which are all discussing a Magnitsky sanctions framework, will hopefully have both of these elements. The law is not complete, and there can be no synchronization of sanctions without both of these elements. And if any one democracy does not include both of these elements, then it's leaving itself open, of course, as a safe haven for this dirty money.
Absolutely. So we'll keep an eye on that and keep you updated as that progresses in the UK. But this issue of Magnitsky sanctions runs through the whole program today. It's one of Alexei Navalny's it's his only demand of the United States and Western Europe is that they sanction these figures that he believes are part of Putin's inner circle, and that is the way to properly and effectively apply pressure to Putin's regime. I mentioned it in the introduction to the program that we had a sweeping series of sanctions and a new sanctions authority issued by the Biden administration here in the US last week. So a new authority giving very broad powers to the US officials to sanction Russian entities for pretty much anything now, if they want to. And then the other sanctions, though, didn't strike me as particularly hard-hitting when it comes to placing direct pressure on Putin and his inner circle. They were disinformation platforms They were, pseudo officials in the Russian puppet government in eastern Ukraine. They weren't these big oligarchs, the people holding Putin's wealth in trust. Paul, I know that you've been quite concerned about, the Biden could have been a lot stronger there, and indeed needs to be a lot stronger if it's going to contribute to saving Alexei Navalny's life by pressuring the Putin regime. And so I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on that, but particularly pose you a question, which is, do you think that such a strong response at the moment would be productive, knowing Putin as we do and the way he behaves and responds to the ways he's prodded by the West or not prodded? Or do you think it's more worthwhile holding those sort of nuclear option sanctions, really going for his personal wealth as leverage to try and secure Alexei Navalny's safe release? So yeah, just be interested. I know you're quite upset about this whole issue. So as we all are. So perhaps your thoughts.
Yeah, so it's something I've been tracking very closely, and of course, it relates closely to the work I do on the Hill. And I think it's impossible to look at what is happening to Navalny and what is happening on the border of Ukraine, of course, as well, where they're amassing troops, right, without understanding kleptocracy and transnational criminal networks like this. On which the Russian state is, of course, based. It not only uses corruption as a form of foreign policy, which we talk about a lot, but the entire Russian state relies on corruption. The way that it's held up, of course, is having the dictator at the center, Putin, and then, his circle of cronies who are essentially their loyalty is assured by providing these various spoils and opportunities to loot Russia. And then that money is transferred to London, to New York, to Miami, to wherever else via the money laundering structure that we've spoken about, to some extent on this program, anonymous shell companies, sleazy banks, secrecy jurisdictions, all that sort of stuff, enablers. So to the Thursday sanctions package, I just want to say that, it's good to see this rhetoric, all right? I mean, from a rhetorical perspective, sure, the way they're talking about Russia and talking about what Putin is doing is very good. The problem is only that when you don't back those words up with really meaningful action, and you call for de-escalation from a regime that has no desire whatsoever to de-escalate and cannot de-escalate really, then you're in a lot of trouble, because in some sense, this just means that Russia will up the ante, and in some sense, this mutual incremental escalation that's going on is just another part of this pattern where Putin sees that, okay, well, this isn't the death blow, this isn't the really meaningful strike that could be made, which, okay, I guess I got to respond in kind and so on and so forth. I think that to really get a reaction out of the Putin regime and to really save Navalny's life right now, yes, absolutely, you must go after these 35 oligarchs and cronies who have been identified by Navalny as the kind of movers and shakers of the Putin regime, and the cronies that have been the worst looters of Russia. And go ahead and sanction 5 of them, and then sort of say the others, we're going to keep on sanctioning until Navalny's safe. And then if he dies, we're not only sanctioning all 35, we're going to sanction debt in secondary market.
Does that not sort of corner Putin though? And I personally, just having observed his behavior over the past few years, not confidently wouldn't take that as a provocation and just do even worse stuff. So is that what they're thinking? Is that what they're doing? They're saying in private, we're about to unleash the sort of nuclear options on you if Navalny doesn't live and is not released?
I hope not. Because Putin's strategy, Putin's work is to sow chaos, right? Mm-hmm. It's like you can't even think about Russia in terms of national interests, right? Because the idea is to loot the state, to transfer that money to the West, and to ensure that there's a constant stream of chaos, a constant stream of mutual escalation, and a constant sort of hand waving that can ensure everyone's kind of distracted from the fact that this looting continues and continues and continues, and the dictatorship continues and continues and continues. So in some sense, to just continue this kind of, okay, here's your off-ramp, Putin, here's your off-ramp. We're always offering him an off-ramp. Every administration offers him an off-ramp. He hasn't won an off-ramp. He never will want an off-ramp. The only way to actually get a response is to really bring the hammer down.
Casey?
Yeah, exactly, Paul. This notion of, I think back in 2014, right? We have late February of 2014, when the Russian troops first began moving into Crimea. And that is when you began seeing this notion of, and this rhetoric around an off-ramp. And again, this was the Obama administration at the time, offering I suppose, a form of a fig leaf to Putin, thinking that, conceptualizing that he is simply mistaken. He simply doesn't know what he's doing. He is simply misunderstanding the facts on the ground. And if only we can convince him, if only we can show him the light or the right path to this off-ramp, then we can get things back on the right track. And I think back then of Angela Merkel's comment, and again, we don't have to talk about the German policy as it pertains to Russia. That's a whole episode for a different time.
Episode,
but her notion, her idea, her framing of Putin as existing in a quote different world than the rest of us. I mean, I think it hits at both of those in the sense that if he lives in a different world, perhaps we can show him that and we can bring him to the light. But if he is living in a different world, that is where he's going to remain. And we have seen time and time, and it's now 7 years since the invasion of southern Ukraine, since the invasion of eastern Ukraine. The notion of an off-ramp should have been jettisoned as soon as it was made. March 18th, 2014, he comes out and he announces the very first forced annexation on the European continent since the days of the Second World War. That is when and where the notion of an off-ramp should have died. And yet we see this notion come up again and again and again, without understanding, without sinking in what this mafia state regime truly is. And Navalny, obviously to his eternal credit, understands it for exactly what it is. And we are recording this podcast, and the far end of this, he was dying before we began recording. He might be dead by the time we are done. There is absolutely no reason. I'm sorry, I don't want to use stronger language than that. There is absolutely no reason that the U.S., Brussels, London, Ottawa cannot come out and sanction each and every one of these oligarchic figures
right now.
That Navalny. What are we losing by not sanctioning Roman Abramovich? What are we losing by not sanctioning Alisher Usmanov? There is no reason that we should not follow Navalny's lead on this, if for no other reason than to illustrate the depths of how he has been treated and how we will respond to that treatment moving forward. There's just no reason whatsoever they shouldn't have been sanctioned already.
And it's worth pointing out, it's not just you guys saying that, and I happen to agree with you. I was sort of putting the what I presume is the Biden administration's plan for this to you guys for comment. But it's Navalny's close friends and personal allies that are still continuing to say, hit the Putin regime with everything you've got in terms of sanctions, anti-money laundering, exposing where the hidden wealth is. Even as their friend, their leader, lies in this dire condition, in this dangerous situation.
That's exactly right. So they want it, and this idea that keeps that crosses the board on. Okay, we want to have a normal relationship with Russia. We want to have a respectful relationship with Russia. You cannot.
It is past time for Washington, for London, for Brussels, for Ottawa, for Canberra, you name it, to understand that there is no such thing as a pro-Western or pro-democratization oligarch. Doesn't matter what regime they come from, whether it's Azerbaijan, whether it's Kazakhstan, whether it's Uzbekistan, it does not matter. That is inherently an oxymoron, because these people feast on the national coffers. They loot the national coffers, and they turn to Western financial secrecy tools to launder those gains and to continue it going.
If I may, then that's an interesting point. So we've only got about sort of 3 to 5 minutes left, guys. So we talked about sanctions. So I take it that you it's time to sort of, if you were in Biden's shoes, what would your policy towards the Putin regime be right now? So we've got these the sanctions that have been suggested by Navalny and his anti-corruption foundation. Navalny himself mentioned 8 oligarchs or senior officials, I think. His foundation named 35. So we're going to sanction them. Are there other steps we should be taking? Other sort of things that are in the works, maybe in Congress, Paul, I don't know, that we could introduce, like that to make a real signal and hopefully influence Putin's behavior in a positive way from here in the US and the EU, and the UK, wherever it is.
At the very least, you make a statement, you make the consequences clear. You say if Navalny dies, all 35 of these guys are going to be on the SDN list. Better than that, you hit 5 right now. You show we mean business. You show this isn't a nothing. I mean, I'm fine with Casey's move too, just going ahead and hitting all 35. I mean, I think that's a-okay. I certainly think also, you start going after the dirty money in the USA, like let's make it very, very clear, like we are going to recover. I'm sure we've got a lot of cases hanging out at DOJ, like let's bring some of these, let's move these up. I mean, you never want to politicize the rule of law process, but there certainly is, like, if a case is out there and ready to go, like now is the time. Let's publicly open investigations. Let's get this going, and I think that you can do this in conjunction with the EU. Obviously, if Germany, again, you don't need to go too deep down the German policy well, but if Germany were to cancel Nord Stream 2 or put that on the right. chopping block and say, like, okay, if you kill Navalny, no Nord Stream 2, that would be huge. And we just saw the Czechs like cancel Rosatom, like so. I mean, like on account of this crazy GRU operation, which we didn't talk about, but it was demonstrated that the GRU was behind this ammunition depot explosion in the Czech Republic. So I mean, it's kind of, and I should also add that these Russia sanctions authorities did not include Nord Stream 2 sanctions, right? They did not include anything on Navalny. They did not include any sanctions on oligarchs. Yep. So again, it was a very small off-ramp type action. And that's exactly what you don't want to do when you've got Navalny, really facing very public, ongoing execution by this brutal regime.
Yeah, just in terms of the timing of it, we also learned, even leaving Navalny to the side, we learned last week, the Treasury Department revealed last week the confirmation that Konstantin Kilimnik, this alleged Russian intelligence asset, was liaising directly with Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's 2016 campaign manager, to funnel internal campaign data, to funnel other proprietary information to Russian intelligence to use for God knows what. I don't want to rehash the 2016 interference operations, but Nate, to your question, what can be done, what should be done, follow Navalny's lead as it pertains to sanction. But beyond that, please finally implement just the broad contours of the anti-corruption counter-kleptocracy playbook, ending anonymity in shell companies, ending anonymity in hedge funds and private equity, ending anonymity in real estate, ending anonymity in art and auction houses. I mean, we have seen these used time and again to work around and circumvent American and Western sanctions. And you are just, you're the horse is out of the stable. You're leaving the barn your door wide open. You can yell sanctions at these people as much as you want. But if you are giving them this get out of sanctions free card, time and again, pick your policy. They can do what they want with it. If you're not implementing that playbook, then you are just, you're just wasting everybody's time.
Casey, that's a great point. And I mean, work with the Europeans where you can, but don't wait up. Don't let the lowest common denominator determine your response. And I think there's some things the USA and the UK, for example, could do very effectively together. I mean, we have all of this Russian money known to be in London, I think there's a lot of action there. And I just want to say to the kind of revelations about disinformation, I thought that was also a really neat part of what happened Thursday. And you could foresee more revelations about corruption, right? Like, I mean, why isn't there more just like, hey, one of the reasons the Magnitsky Act is so effective is because when you sanction oligarchs, the Russian people get it, right? When they see what happened Thursday, that we're going after Russia for X, Y, and Z, and we're hitting all these low-level people and whatever else, the Russian people are like, oh, this is just another escalatory action from the United States. But when you hit like oligarchs, they hate the oligarchs.
The people have actually ripped them off blind indeed.
Yeah. And they don't want these people to be able to enjoy their London properties or their New York City properties.
Okay, chaps. Well, that is unfortunately all we've got time for this week. Thank you so much for your insights again. I hope someone in the White House was listening to those last few minutes. And I look forward to welcoming you back in a couple of weeks.
I hope they were listening too, Nate.
Sadly, that's all we have time for this week. Of course, we send Alexei Navalny and his family our thoughts and prayers, and hope also that enough international pressure could be brought to bear to secure his release. Don't forget to visit hudson.org on or after April 23rd for our interview with Venezuela's interim president, Juan Guaido, on how the Maduro regime's kleptocracy has brought what was once South America's wealthiest country to its knees. If you're enjoying the show, please, as always, remember to subscribe and share with your friends. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.